extract from Gregorovius' History of Medieval Athens, which I will translate while you see the original on slide. When one stands by the monument of Lysikrates, the sight of the Acropolis is rather strange. One can see the colossal eastern side of the rock with its deep curvature and no Greek building, none of the temples on it, but only the surrounding wall with the rampart, so that the Acropolis is presented like the Rocca di Sepime of the Frankish years, like a medieval site. This awkward view of the Acropolis that one gets when standing by the courageous monument of Lysikrates, described here by Gregorovius, has an uncanny truth about it, difficult if not impossible to imagine today. Indeed, if the above description refers to a specific viewpoint from which most of the buildings inside the Acropolis were not visible, it is also true that it could successfully represent, in a metaphorical sense, attitudes towards the Acropolis and its monuments, especially the Parthenon, from late antiquity until the 17th century. For if today the importance and symbolic value of the Parthenon are firmly established in Greece and abroad, things have not always been so. Admiration has neither been diachronic nor guaranteed. For Plato, for example, the Periclean building program was not only an extravagant waste of money, but also an example of how art can be used to corrupt the citizens. Much later, however, and in a different tone, Plutarch praises the monument of the Acropolis in a way that brings to mind modern criticism. Pausanias, on the other hand, says surprisingly little about it, except for the detailed passages he devotes to the famous statue of Athena in the temple, and so does Pliny, only describes the statue of Athena. As you can see, even in antiquity, the Parthenon did not necessarily attract all the attention to itself, nor was it accepted unanimously without challenge. And things do not get better with time. As the fame of Athens gradually wanes and the city is forgotten after the 4th century, so too the Parthenon disappears from the writer's view. I will give you 3 characteristic examples here to make my point. First, depictions of Athens before the 17th century, where you can see it as a Flemish city in a 15th century chronicle, and of course, not just the Parthenon, but everything is out of place. Then Athens has a German fortress in 1493, or Athens, again, imaginary view of Athens, which again shows that the ideas people had of it had nothing to do with reality. Not just in depictions, though, the name itself of the Parthenon or the Acropolis disappeared from documents. The monument, of course, was there, but it was named according to its function. So it became the Church of the Virgin, it became the Catholic Church of Notre Dame later. The Catalans called the Acropolis the Castel de Setines, or Chateau de Setines from the Burgundians. And of course, after the Ottoman conquest, Via Chelebi praised it as the most beautiful mosque in the world. Here is a picture of the Parthenon as a mosque. This surprising absence of the Parthenon from the medieval landscape is actually confirmed in poetry. The only poem to have reached us from the Middle Ages, which looks upon Athens through the eyes of a lover of antiquity, is provocative in its blatant lack of acknowledgement towards the monument. The author is Michael Choniates, who was Metropolitan of Athens between 1182 and 1205. Choniates admired the city for its illustrious history and its glorious monuments, and was hoping to find something of the long-lost glory of Athens and its cultured citizens in the city and people of his time. It seems, though, that he quickly became disillusioned, and his letters and other writings testify to his disappointment that nothing has survived of the famous city of art and knowledge. The poem he composed, verses of the most wise metropolitan of Athens, Kyr Michael Choniates, on the original reconstruction of the city of Athens, reflects these feelings. The poem, probably the earliest of its kind, it predates even Dubélès' Antiquities of Rome, introduces some very important important elements typical of this type of poetry or monuments. The frustrated eroticism of the viewer, the realization that Greece's glorious past is now lost and beyond grasp, the wish to reproduce an image of this lost world, acknowledging at the same time the limitations of word and image to fully incarnate what is lost. But what I want to underline here is the following paradox. How could Choniates complain, among other things, that I see Athens nowhere, or perished the whole renown of Athens, not even a token of it may one see, doing so from inside the very monument that came to be at the center of everybody's view and attention from the 18th century onwards. He was writing this from inside the Parthenon. Now, this is not to say that Choniates were not aware that was an ancient monument, but his attitude helps us understand the shift of emphasis. People see every time what they expect to see, and Choniates saw the Church of the Virgin. Despite his love for antiquity, he did not have the eyes of an archaeologist or an art historian. It is with Winckelmann's work that the attitude towards antiquities began to change, especially as a result of the wide dissemination and popularization of his history of ancient art. And the famous Prière sur l'Acropole by Renan vividly shows, and I have highlighted there for your convenience some keywords, the stark contrast between the Parthenon of late antiquity and the Middle Ages on the one hand, and the Parthenon as it was perceived after the 18th century. All this vocabulary that I have highlighted, is based on Winckelmann's description of antiquities, and Renan's text itself has become a key text of Romantic ideology. Renan's style is a representative one of writing about the Parthenon, found also in travel accounts, architectural treatises, and dissertations on ancient Greek art. Following Winckelmann, it was generally agreed that the temple is ideal and divine in its beauty and in the skill involved in its sculptures. Everybody saw it as a product of a democratic city-state and the work of free people. The monument became closely connected with the landscape in which it belongs, and it was seen to maintain the perfect balance between nature and art. Travelers in particular become more personally involved in their responses. Long lyrical passages often express sadness about the ruined state of the Parthenon, nostalgia for its lost glories, and the wish for imagination to reconstruct the ancient world. But nothing between Plutarch and Winckelmann could have prepared us for such worldwide acclaim in modern times. The reasons that led to this change of heart are intimately connected with the changing attitudes of the West towards Greece after the 17th century, and particularly the reappraisal of Athens by educated people of Europe and their recognition of its rich cultural heritage. They are also connected to the foundation of the modern Greek state. The symbolic weight that the Parthenon acquires is, in other words, the result of the ideological frame of the Greek War of Independence, the forging of a modern Greek identity, and Greek nationalism. And I will remind you just an example of General Ioannis writing in his memoirs regarding some statues that were discovered that these are the things we fought for. It is indicative to point out that from the arrival of King Otto and Leo von Klenz's inaugural speech on the Acropolis, Greek freedom and Greek values have always been somehow linked to the ancient monuments, and in particular to the Parthenon. Palamas described it as the heart of the race. It is in the 19th century, therefore, that we begin to find poems dedicated to the Parthenon. The moment when the monument stops being a useful building and is elevated to a work of art, when it becomes a symbol and moves into the sphere of the ideal, the grand and the beautiful, as they say, and becomes detached from historical time. And you can see this difference by comparing this depiction of the Parthenon before the buildings were removed with this photograph by Boissonnas later, this idea of purification and removing of everything that pointed to the historical period between antiquity and the modern times. Now, in these first poems about the Parthenon, we may discern two different trends. those which look at the monument through the lens of idealism and which recycle ideas and terms first used by Winckelmann, and those, not many, which introduce a political and anti-imperialist trend which follows the long battle for the restitution of the marbles in Greece. The transition that I have described from the ideal to the real, from the real to the ideal, from the utilitarian to the aesthetic, has not proved beneficial for the Parthenon. Admiration has engendered the desire to possess bits of it, and the imperialist culture of the great powers in the 19th century led to the fashion of collecting and exhibiting antiquities. The poems dedicated to the Parthenon do not begin with odes and lofty expressions, but with the satirical pen of Lord Byron, who attacks Elgin for robbing the monuments of its sculptures. So you have here a painting by Edward Dodwell in 1905 showing Elgin, well, people removing the sculptures of the Parthenon. It is indeed Elgin's name, more than Morosini's, the person who bombarded the Parthenon, that accompanies the introduction of the Parthenon in the modern world. The first poems, therefore, written on the Parthenon are linked to the arrival of the marbles in London, which begins in 1805, 1802 and until 1811. Byron, in his famous Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, sits among the ruins of the Parthenon, and his sadness becomes anger against Elgin and the destruction he has brought with his actions. His anger is in turn transformed to a curse against Elgin and his family in his poem The Curse of Minerva, in which he also, brings a political twist. As William St. Clair's notes, Elgin did not have the right to rob a proud people of their precious heritage or to lay his hands on a monument that stood there for 2,000 years. Still, what one might call the Elgin marbles poetry does not take center stage in the poetry devoted to the Parthenon. After Byron, a handful of poems only the matter, as you can see. The anti-imperialist declaration Give Back the Elgin Marbles by Sir Roger Casement. You have there the beginning of the poem. The poetic meditation Christmas in the Elgin Room by Thomas Hardy. And many years later, the poem Britannico Museo, that's in 1999 by Kiki Moulin. They all underline, though in a different style and tone, that the British Museum and the British climate are incompatible with the marbles. They express the sculptors' nostalgia for their country of origin and their ill-suited circumstances. An allusion, of course, to the interdependence of landscape and architecture in relation to ancient monuments. But if numbers is what we are looking for, then the vast majority of poems on the Parthenon belong to the tradition of idealism. They all share an admiration for ancient Greek culture and place its art at the pinnacle of civilization. The ideal, the beautiful, the cult of whiteness, democracy and freedom are key words here. A random glance through many poems of the 19th and early 20th centuries confirms this. They begin with the Oxford Prize poem of 1811, Parthenon by Richard Burden, a detailed description of the monument and its sculptures. Then we have the poem L'Acropole d'Athènes by the French poet Louise Colet, awarded by the Académie Française in 1854. And of course a number of Greek poems from 1858 onwards, which express admiration for the perceived grandeur of the monument, sadness for its ruined state, awareness that the devastation brought by time and circumstances is irrevocable. And I highlight again the vocabulary that shows you how they follow the same tradition of idealism. Finally, frustration caused by the poet's feelings of inferiority when compared to such masterpieces of art from classical antiquity. Now, the poems I shall discuss in more detail with you tonight should be seen against this background of idealizing attitudes, and they are chosen because they display an originality of thought and expression in an otherwise predictable context, or because their groundbreaking radical attitudes create an interesting counterpart to the overwhelmingly idealistic approach to the monument. One of the earliest such examples is the Parthenon by Herman Melville. which is on your handout. Melville travelled in Europe and the Levant over a period of 8 months from October 1856 to May 1857. The diaries he kept of those travels include interesting and original comments on the places and monuments he visited, including the Acropolis. They also show his acquaintance with Greek history and culture, as well as his familiarity with the well-established discourse related to the Parthenon and its perceived qualities, a possible outcome also of his guidebook, Murray's Handbook for Travellers in Greece. As is the case with most guides at the time, and you may also have heard of Baedeker, it popularized the idealizing tradition of Romantic Hellenism in the reception of ancient art. The originality of the Parthenon lies to a great extent in the perspective it introduces, that of a learned tourist, and also in its subtle irony. This is not to say that there were not other learned tourists, of course, but that such visitors did not usually write poetry but travel accounts, and those who wrote poetry, irrespective of whether they have travelled to Greece or not, follow a different pattern as I've shown you in the previous poems. Therefore, Melville is the only poet who brings the style of travel literature into a poem. As you can see, the poem is divided into 4 sections which allow different views of the monument, and this is a very photographic approach, original in itself, and it has its own history in travel literature. Indeed, from the 17th century onwards, when the interest in Greek antiquities began to gain ground, an unnoticed and almost unfelt aspect of the early description of Athens is its image through binoculars or lunettes de longue vue. There's also a joke, for example, by George Weller, who traveled to Greece with Jacob Spode about people before them who did not see the monuments. And Weller says they must have looked from the wrong side of the legs, in showing how, this was becoming a very popular thing to do. The space of the city and its monuments becomes, for the first time, through the use of binoculars and the framing possibilities they offer, objects of European representations. It is even more true of the art of photography, as you can see there, which was becoming very popular in the 19th century. Amongst the most acclaimed photographers of the Parthenon at the time was William James Stillman, an American whose album The Acropolis of Athens, illustrated picturesquely and architecturally in photography, was published in 1870. The poem, Melville's poem, incorporates a large amount of aesthetic discourse on the Parthenon. Its view from afar, as well as following the traditional trajectory of the foreign visitor, like Dodwell, for example, underlines its otherworldly character, suggested by words such as estranged in sight, aerial gleaming, sun cloud, motionless, etc. Estranged in sight in particular suggests both its unique character, that makes the Parthenon stand out and a part of the actual landscape that surrounds it, but also confirms the fact that in many instances in travel writing, the monument was indeed seen out of context. Its admiration was related to ancient Greece, and travelers often failed to link it to the contemporary city, but preferred to reconstruct the ancient world that gave birth to such a majestic monument. But Melville's poem, in Melville's poem, this link with antiquity is extremely original in its own right. As you can see in section 2, the poet is approaching the monument, and before actually zooming on the frieze, which is the 3rd section, he is close enough to grasp the structure and parts as a whole, and to that whole he attributes the sensual characteristics of a woman. Now, in what ways can a temple and a woman be compared? Remember when I mentioned, with Choniates especially, that there's always a more or less explicit amount of eroticism involved when poets turn to ancient monuments. Melville's originality lies in the person he chooses to compare the Parthenon with. Lais was famous in antiquity for her exceptional beauty, and this could be a first point of convergence. Both become representative of the ideal and the beautiful in their kind. What is more, Melville may well be suggesting that just as Lais is using artificial means to improve her natural beauty, so too the Parthenon depends on optical illusions to enhance its impression on the viewer. In other words, both Lais and the Parthenon show in what way art can enhance and perfect natural beauty. Lais, however, was not simply a woman of extreme beauty, but also a courtesan. Is this an indication that Melville admired these women for their culture and education? The fact that the final pronouncement on art in the fourth section is made by Aspasia may confirm this. But such an association may imply a deliberately meretricious quality in Lais's beauty appropriate to the poem. Melville may have in mind here all those pilgrims that paid visits to the monument contributed to what Callas will call later its prostitution, an association that is not altogether out of place, and I mean by that the Parthenon had become a harem sometime during the Ottoman occupation, and during the times of the Demetrius the Besieger also the Erechtheion was used for similar purposes. So, if this is indeed the case, then Melville's poem is unique in introducing the association of tourism and debasement, one that will be strongly criticized by Callas in his poem Acropolis. In any case, Melville's response to the Parthenon is that of a learned tourist who can appreciate what he sees and can be inspired by it. And he certainly keeps the serene detachment that is so typical of all non-Greek poets when facing the famous monument. For the Greeks, on the other hand, the Parthenon revealed a more complex problem. The poems display quite clearly a struggle to cope with the remains of a glorious past, as they try to justify their own artistic essence in relation to it. What they emphasize is their frustration or deception, and the real motif is used extensively to suggest the glories of the past and the present miseries of Greece. I will only discuss here two characteristic examples because they raise points that will be explored later in much more powerful poems. One stanza from Vasileiadis' The Parthenon, and then a poem by Kleanthis Papazoglou, Reminiscence of the Parthenon. The Parthenon, Vasileiadis' Parthenon, is a long narrative poem of 4 sections in which the poet tells the whole story of the temple throughout the centuries. The contrast between antiquity and Vasileiadis' own time is made clear from the very beginning and is kept throughout the poem. But the poem includes an interesting paradox. On the one hand, Vasileiadis only sees in the Parthenon dead marbles that can no longer be brought back to life. But on the other, as you can see on the slide, it is writing about the Parthenon, or even on the Parthenon, that gives the troubled poet hopes of immortality. Writing about the Parthenon, even a ruined Parthenon, is equivalent to engraving one's name on the drum of a marble column, an act supposed to give immortality to the author. Byron is the famous example here, for he indeed carved his name on the temple of Poseidon at Sunion. Like fragment hunting, André Segedi Massacre reports, graffiti writing was a frequent pastime of the foreign visitor, and many Philhellenes, especially those who fought inside the Acropolis during the Greek War of Independence, carved their names for posterity on the columns of the Parthenon. One of Stillman's photographs actually focuses on those names, and they can be seen on the right. Not very clearly, I'm afraid, but for Stillman, as for Vasileiadis, such an act of petty vandalism, as we would have seen it today, is transformed. The Parthenon, Stillman suggests, is not defaced but enlivened, perhaps even ennobled by the signatures of men who came from abroad to help the Greeks regain their freedom, and Stillman was one of them. And the association of Byron with the Greek struggle certainly sanctifies his own act. On the other hand, the idea of transcendence associated with the act of writing on stone has not passed unnoticed. The other poem by Papazoglou does something similar. You can see the speaker in this poem approaches the Parthenon as a child who admires the monument with the naivety and happiness of youth that still sees the ideal in the world. The reference to it is rather stereotypical, of course. In traditional criticism, the monument was indeed perceived as belonging to an era that was the childhood of humanity, encompassing youth, innocence, and note then how writing on the Parthenon lights a fire in the child's soul. so that as a result his thoughts and dreams partake of the ideal and the beautiful that the Parthenon is believed to represent. We are encouraged to agree that looking at the Parthenon, and even more writing on the Parthenon, inspires people, elevates their thoughts, shapes their being, and brings them into the higher realms of art. Exposure to it is a kind of Bildung. The last stanza seems to hint, just like in the case of Vasileiadis, that the preservation of the poet's name on the monument implies poetic acclaim. But a bold satire from the left of the interwar period, as Makis Parselinos' poem Hymn to the Parthenon, is ruthless in its criticism of such mentalities, and you can see he's making fun of the idea of these, stereotypes. If I say nothing about your Parthenon, how can I ever become a great poet? Then, towards the end especially, he satirizes the use of the Parthenon and other monuments, to advertise different products. Used as a tout, a touristic tout, and the same idea is used even further in the poem by Callas. And here you have an advertisement with the Parthenon on it. Now, at this point, I will turn to Keats's famous sonnet on seeing the Elgin marbles, because it brings together the threads of my discussion so far, in the sense that it responds to the arrival and purchase of the Elgin marbles by the British Museum. It presupposes the tradition of idealism that we have seen in the other poems, but it also ultimately challenges these ideas. How can one write about art that has been removed from its original location? How can one understand and appropriate a tradition that's not one's own? When the marbles arrived in England in 1801, they were greeted with indifference and were put in a storeroom. They were first exhibited privately in 1807, and again the reactions of the viewers were not what we would have expected by today's standards. Scott, who has researched extensively in archival and published material of that period, gives representative examples. Some people were disappointed, he notes. The whole was a mass of ruins. Byron, in his famous English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, called the marbles Theban freaks, mishapen monuments and maimed antiques. When the long debate about their artistic value finally ended in 1916 and they were purchased by the British Museum, the tide had changed. The dominant aesthetic discourse emphasized their perfection and truth to nature. Important painters and sculptors such as Benjamin West, Thomas Lawrence, and John Flaxman agreed that the marbles were the finest things ever discovered. Their acceptance marked a new era in British taste. Hope was expressed that with a more constant examination of those divine models, a purity of taste and accuracy of judgment would come up in the mind of the students. The marbles were purchased as national treasures in the hope that they would inspire British artists, particularly the young. The poem becomes the stage on which the conflicting views of the experts and the humble reaction of a young poet meet. The marbles are not mentioned at all throughout the poem, but you can feel their impact and their symbolic weight without a doubt. The weak spirit of a young artist hopes to be inspired and strengthened, but what comes forward instead is an agonizing struggle against death. Keats's selection of vocabulary emphasizes the widely accepted grandeur of the sculptures on the one hand and their paralyzing effect on the artist on the other. Instead of being uplifted, the poet is being compared to a sick eagle for whom the sky is only a distant, unreachable goal. The likeness that major critics saw in the art of the marbles and their ability to breathe life seem only to impose inertia and death. The poet's heart experiences an indescribable feud and most dizzy pain that clouds the mind against the appreciation of such masterpieces. But if the sonnet asserts the poet's weakness and mortality, it also questions that side of criticism that rejects the marbles' fragmentariness by emphasizing their ideal character and perfection. They are indeed the inconceivable glories of the brain, not only because the artist's imagination can hardly grasp their beauty and magnificence, but also because they are the works of a foreign civilization that is lost in time. The marbles are here, but come from far away, both chronologically and spatially, and therefore the context is hard to reconstruct. We cannot really go back to ancient Greece, and we cannot really appreciate them in their true context. Extracted from the temple in which they belong, they are exposed now, as William Sinclair said, outside in the British Museum, and Keats boldly acknowledges here, in spite of the dominant discourse, that Grecian grandeur cannot be disconnected from the rude wasting of all time. Those sunny peaks of ancient art are lost, both because of the cloudy setting of Bloomsbury, as Casement also said, and because they have lost their integrity. They are fallen masterpieces, shadows of what they used to be. Now, not that this leaves the poet unaffected. The encounter of the artist with what used to be a work of art of incomparable greatness engenders thoughts about the nature and value of artistic creation. If those wonders, as he calls them, have perished, in spite of the hardness and durability of their material, what is the fate that awaits the young poet, whose inspiration and medium seem to be much more perishable? The undescribable feud and most dizzy pain the poet confesses here are also the result of his realization that, unlike his ancient Greek counterpart, he cannot yet control the range of his inspiration, as the phrase below remains suggests, and that brings him very close to his Greek counterparts of the 19th century, which similarly expressed, albeit for different reasons, a comparable predicament in the presence of antiquities. Now, a long jump will take us from the 19th to the 20th century to Callas' 1933 poem, Acropolis. And this is, I will finish this section with 3 poems, Acropolis, and then 2 more to show the more radical reactions against the Parthenon. Now, this abrupt transition leaves out the voices of the demodicists, with Palamas prominent among them. The most important characteristic in their approach to the Parthenon is that they oppose the symbolic value of the monument, as it had become in the 19th century, and especially the notion that writing about the Parthenon and using the Harerusa would restore the tradition the monument came to represent in the newly founded Greek state. The demodicists link such ideas to their polemical discourse about the modern Greek language. The Parthenon is associated with Harerusa and the dead elements of Greek tradition. That is why they are against the restoration of the Parthenon, and their poetry usually involves the juxtaposition of the ancient ruins with flowers or birds that on a deeper level symbolize the modern Greek language and its power to enliven the relics of the past. But as far as challenge goes, so far we have seen only subtle criticism of the tradition of idealism. Callas' poem Acropolis, on the other hand, is the first one to turn towards the Parthenon, and that's on your handout as well, with a deconstructive impetus of a Marinetti and the futurists. With it, he will inaugurate a strong iconoclastic tradition, and Acropolis will remain one of the most powerful poems in that category. In order to understand this poem, we must remind ourselves of the extremities of demodicisim. When Callas says in the foreground the Parthenos, he's making fun of Psycharis' suggestion that we should not say the Parthenon anymore, but the Parthenos, to make it conform with the morphology of the demotic as he had wanted it. We also have to be aware of the sentimental cries of Renan, further down, the Acropolis official verger. The poem castigates the contribution of photography, tourism, and advertising in the transformation of the monument from a work of art into a commodity. Strong and vivid images that bring to mind features of the cinema expose and debase the Parthenon, attacking in the face what Callas perceives as the very symbol of bourgeois attitudes. The Parthenon epitomizes the values of the official state, and its acclaimed repose and detachment could be interpreted as an immovable and stagnant frame of mind, indifferent to the real problems ravaging society. The apex of this is, of course, nationalism and fascism. It is well known that during the Metaxas dictatorship, the Parthenon was used to legitimize authority and power in Macronissos, called by the authority the New Parthenon. But why should professional photography be to blame? The works of the Swiss Fred Boissonnas and Nelly helped to publicize Greece abroad. Such publicity is criticized by Callas, for as well as perpetuating misconceptions about Greek art and culture, it foreshadows the touristic development of the Parthenon and, according to Callas, its humiliation. The reference to the dancer Delilah in the middle of the first column brings to mind Nelly's famous photographs of the dancers Spyridon and Nikolska, who in 1927 and 1929 respectively were photographed naked on the Parthenon, placing thus the female body symmetrically against the classical purity of the Acropolis. Such attitudes are interpreted by Callas as yet another step toward the debasement of the ancient temple. The attempt to associate the naked body of the dancer with the aesthetics of the classical nude fades, because they are both out of their original setting and the values which supported them. The piling up of the dancer's limbs, again, feet, belly, breasts, hands, disheveled hair, proves this point, I think. The body has lost the vertical stature of a classical statue and has become a heap of severed members. Such a deconstruction of the ideal is bitterly underlined by the scene of prostitution in the lines at the very bottom of the first column, hidden under a fake carroted skirt, and leaves the women with fat bellies and the men with tubes of 606, etc. Callas is here subverting the very name Parthenon with the connotation of purity it includes. The erotic element associated with the Parthenon is challenged through this imagery and taken to its extremes. The ideas of Melville's poem into a modern and very radical context. Acropolis is an ekphrastic poem which does not restore the ancient temple, but following Marinetti's urges, blows apart the icon formed by the bourgeois perceptions linked with it. Ultimately, the Parthenon is put by the poet to the service of his own understanding of art. It becomes the powder keg, and the Parthenon was a powder keg during the War of Independence, that explodes all the conventional perceptions woven around it. Callas's avant-garde view of art is destroying every link with tradition. If Delilah has ironically survived Samson, the poet's art inherits the power of Morosini's canons, which are turned against the inauthentic icon. His cylindrical pen will act as a new Samson who will demolish the temple together with all those infidels who disgrace it. From that point of view, the word Acropolisis, in the middle of the second column, is of some significance. By debasing the word in a demoticist way, the poet does not only mock the movement, but shows through the use of the plural that the Acropolises, the Acropolis, are just faked icons created by various manipulation, ideological or others. The English or American poets who write about the Parthenon during and after the Second World War are not altogether dismissive of the Parthenon, but appear to have preserved what has always been characteristic of foreign visitors to Greece, the eyes and attitudes of the tourists. Nevertheless, they are no longer the tourists who cannot see beyond the idealized perceptions of Winckelmann, Murray or Wiedeker, and other famous travel guides. They are aware of the tradition behind the monument of the Acropolis, of course, but they prefer to highlight the contrast that exists between the modern vibrant city and the classical past. And I will discuss in that context the two last poems, Darrell's Acropolis and Josephine Jacobson's An Absence of Slaves, so a British poet and an American poet. Now, they are both daring in alluding in a rather bold and provocative manner to the social and political situation in Greece in the late 60s. Observe how Darrell's perspective is changing in this poem, shifting as it does from the ideal height of the temple to the surrounding area of the rock. And that's the second part of it. The Acropolis of Athens takes shape with the support of Darwin's memories from his time in Egypt, in a composite image of East and West, representative really of what the Parthenon used to be before the 19th century. The dirty alleyways, the lingering smells, the blazing souk, and images of poverty are as much those of Egypt as those of the Anaphiotica area around the Acropolis. The print in ink depicts now an alternative image in which the light of violet Athens, Menexedenia Athena, it was described in more traditional poetry by Palamas, for example, is replaced by the darkness scent of the night and violet dust. The mention of the Socratic prison, there in the third line, the bleak atmosphere of the cemetery, and the word carnage, put the glorious and radiant monuments of antiquity into a rather foreboding scenery in which the laurels of ancient glory crack like parchments in the wind. The grand ideal and brightness associated with the Parthenon are replaced here with tombs, knowing mandolins, and sullen races, and sleepy tourists who still hope that they will discover an ideal that now seems to be waning. And this is another Dodwell depiction of the Parthenon, before the removal of all these buildings around it. Last but not least, Jacobson's poem is another blow to the tradition of idealism and may also have been written with the Greek Junda in mind. The rejection of the widely accepted ideal of the Parthenon was the creation of a democratic society that enjoyed freedom is darkened, and that's again on the handout, by her daring reference to slavery in the title of the poem, An Absence of Slaves, and her reference to the pyramids. Indeed, since Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art, the importance of ancient Greek values such as freedom and democracy was constantly compared and contrasted with Egyptian society, and the art of each country reflected the values of their systems. What is different here compared to all the other poems of on the Parthenon is the introduction of the voice of the Greek guide. So far, the experience of the Parthenon was personal, mediated only by a travel guide, or by the classical knowledge of the visitor. Here, on the other hand, the voice of the guide acts as a mediator between the relics of the past and the tourists. Again, unlike previous poems, where we have a whole group here, so it's Greece of the 60s, with the tourism taking its peak. On a first level, of course, this reflects the reality of the time, but on a deeper level, this is not without consequences. Having a Greek promoting the Greek values, especially in the late 60s, becomes somehow propagandistic. The guide sounds a bit too eager to convince us about the values of freedom and democracy. Such subversion is not unique, of course. In Darwin's poem, the one I presented to you before, the reference to the soft then grammar at the beginning and the conjugation of nouns makes the experience of the classics a mechanical endeavor, a kind of subject teaching with possibly ideological orientation. And this is something that has been criticized not just by Darwin here, but also by Greek poets like Thevet and Christos. To conclude, the poems devoted to the Parthenon span from the early 19th century to the late 20th century, and the majority, as we have seen, were published between 1850 and 1940. Overall, irrespective of whether they were written by Greek or foreign poets, they display similar attitudes towards the monument, attitudes that involve admiration, awe, respect, and deep emotional responses of the Renan type. Nevertheless, a small number among them went beyond the tradition of idealism and romantic Hellenism. Melville used the new art of photography to frame his poem and gives us different points of view, physical but also more indirectly ideological. Keats challenged in a way that reminds us of the Greek poets, the burden of a foreign tradition that is experienced out of its geographical and historical contexts. The reaction to the ideological exploitation of the Parthenon was taken to its extremes in the poem of Nicholas Callas, who, in the manner of Marinetti, proposes the complete destruction of the Parthenon and all the ideological clusters attached to it for the sake of the new poetry. Finally, the poets that come after the Second World War all find a more or less direct way to continue the deconstructive tradition of Callas. Such as we've seen the reactions of Dodwell and Jacobsen, they all show that the modern poets cannot fail to see how an ancient monument that has been in the process of being restored and purified for the last 2 centuries keeps collapsing under the ideological and historical circumstances that frame it.